Have you ever wondered how exactly does Disney execute some of their engineering projects? Things like closing Big Thunder Mountain Railroad for over a year to do a massive refurbishment, or how they actually pulled off the massive Epcot's Future World overhaul, or maybe something simpler like how do they renovate the rooms at the hotel, or how do they renovate a pool at a hotel, like the recent closure and refurbishment of Stormalong Bay at the Beach and Yacht Club. Well, we recently got the opportunity to interview some of the Disney cast members responsible for projects just like this and learn a little bit more about the behind the scenes of the Disney process. But of course, it wouldn't be a Mouselets Monday if I didn't first do a deep dive, so let's dive into it. One of the biggest challenges that Disney has to face is when they have to make a big and sudden change. That could look like the aftermath of the 1973 oil embargo that I talk about so frequently, where they had to scrap some of the major plans for the monorail resorts, or maybe the security changes in the parks after 9/11, or when Disney had to ban swimming in their lakes, because that was a huge one, because it really changed Disney as a whole. Specifically, that piece, banning swimming in the lakes, created such an increased importance in Disney pools and made pools such a critical piece of Disney infrastructure that kind of go forgotten by many guests. And therefore, any impacts to actually have to close a Disney pool for any reason are significant. Because above all, the guest experience is so critical to Disney. Anything that impacts it causes frustration for guests and can even lead to financial losses. And so if you've ever wanted to learn more about the Disney engineering process, this video is for you. And what better topic to cover than the news that everyone was discussing this year, the 6-month closure of the Stormalong Bay pool at Beach and Yacht Club. But first, let's get into a little bit of background information. The year is 1971. It is a hot day in Florida. And what better way to cool off than a quick dip in the Seven Seas Lagoon or Bay Lake? Because when Disney World opened, this was the choice for many guests for a resort day. Sure, they had great pools, like the lava pool to Polynesian was iconic even then, but swimming in the lakes was really pushed by Disney too. They invested millions of dollars in creating the Seven Seas Lagoon and in cleaning Bay Lake to make it safe for swimming. And if you've been to Disney World in the past 30 years or so, you're probably thinking, what? Who would swim in Bay Lake or Seven Seas Lagoon? Okay, there's alligators, the water doesn't look that clean, and why would anyone go in the lake when they could go into the pool? But actually, swimming in the lakes was a massive part of Disney's greater plan. And in fact, Disney actually did so much work to make swimming and other water activities in the lakes even possible. Because I've talked about the fact that when Disney bought the land that Walt Disney World is on, it was basically unincorporated swampland. There was almost nothing there. There were 2 cabins, there was a dirt road, there was an island, but that's basically it. Disney had to go in and add everything. Utilities, roads, telephone systems, and more. And the other thing they did was take Bay Lake, which was a very natural Florida lake, and drain almost the entire thing. The reason being was they wanted to clean out all of the swamp-like muck from the bottom. And so they dredged it, and then at the very bottom, they found something very, very cool. Pristine white sand. And this sand was used to create the beaches at the Contemporary Resort, at the campground, and at the Polynesian Resort. And to refill the lake as well as the Seven Seas Lagoon, they tapped into the Florida aquifer. And in the end, they created the perfect place for a lot of Vacation Kingdom activities. I'm sorry, I know I said I was done covering the Vacation Kingdom, but I just realized there's so much more to talk about. Now, if you don't know about the Vacation Kingdom, let me give you a mini intro, but I have a full deep dive that you should probably watch. But basically, back when Walt Disney World opened, there was only one theme park, Magic Kingdom. But Disney wanted guests to stay for multiple days. And so what they did was they offered all sorts of on-site activities like horseback riding or archery or tennis or golf or sailing or surfing or swimming. Swimming in the pools and swimming in the lakes. And so each of the Magic Kingdom area resorts had beaches with that pristine white sand that came from the bottom of Bay Lake, and they had swimming lines to mark the swimming areas, they had docks, they had lifeguards, and they had hundreds of chairs for people to tan or enjoy the beaches. In many ways, the lakes were really attempting to rival nearby Florida beaches. And while all of the resorts had pools, it was more common to see the beaches packed with people. One important thing to note, for reference at the time, alligators were an endangered species, so they were just not seen that commonly in the area. But not only that, Disney went to lengths to remove a lot of the alligators that were in those lakes to other areas on or off property. But point being, swimming in the lakes at the time were not really a concern. They were clean and they were safe. And really that meant that swimming in the Walt Disney World lakes was really a huge part of the culture at the time. Many people who stayed at the Disney resorts from 1971 until the mid-1990s look really fondly back on the times of swimming in these lakes. It was an iconic part of their trip. Now, what changed? Well, first, some other important information here, and that is that Disney sort of went on a hiatus from adding new resorts around 1975. There was the Polynesian and the Contemporary Resort, which opened in 1971, as well as the Fort Wilderness Campground. They added the Golf Resort, which we covered a couple of weeks ago, in 1973, although that was not located on a water where you could swim. And they also added some resorts at the Lake Buena Vista community. But other than that, there were no new resorts built for almost 15 years, and that meant that there weren't really changes in how those resorts functioned during that time either. But then Michael Eisner comes in. Michael Eisner saw a company that was really struggling in the mid-1980s, and he, in many ways, completely transformed it. One of his biggest priorities was popping up a bunch of new resorts. The first two that he built were the Grand Floridian and Caribbean Beach Resort, the first moderate resort. Now, the Grand Floridian absolutely allowed and advertised swimming. It was located on the same Seven Seas Lagoon, it had beautiful beaches, and it really matched the entire Florida theming of the resort. In fact, many of the most iconic promotional photos of the Grand Floridian are of its beautiful beaches. But Caribbean Beach, with its barefoot bay lake, this one actually didn't really offer swimming, at least in much of a large capacity. Guests would more frequently use the marina to rent all sorts of boats, but supposedly swimming there was very limited and only in one small portion of the Barbados section where you couldn't go very deep. And it's documented that this was because swimming in the lakes was being phased out during this time. Now, a couple of years later, more resorts pop up. We have the Swan and Dolphin Resort, we have the Port Orleans Resort, we have Dixie Landing Resort, and we have the Beach and the Yacht Club Resort, which is the focus of this video. These two resorts, the Beach and the Yacht Club, are located on Crescent Lake, and they are definitely most famous for the incredibly massive, amazing pool called Stormalong Bay. And before we can dive into the insane history and the current story of this pool, it is worth noting that very briefly, guests were allowed to swim in Crescent Lake being the lake by Beach and Yacht Club and by the boardwalk. In fact, there are promotional photos that actually show guests wading into this water. But eventually, by the mid to late 1990s, swimming in the lakes was officially eliminated from Disney World. Instead, the focus became pools. This is the time that we got some of the most iconic Disney pools at the time, like the Grand Floridian pool remodel in 2001 with that entire grotto area, or the Contemporary pool remodel, which has that huge slide and water play area. Even the pools at the very first Valley Resort, the All-Stars, were themed and elevated above a typical hotel pool. But by far, then and now, the greatest, most spectacular pool on Disney property is Stormalong Bay, the pool complex at the Beach and Yacht Club. And not only does this pool have an incredible history, but it also received a recent refurbishment that makes my engineering mind go like, whoa, there's so much more that went into it than you would ever realize. So let's dive into that with the help of the Disney team.
Stormalong Bay Shipwreck Cove has 7 bodies of water. There are 3 spas at Stormalong Bay. There are 3 lagoons at Stormalong as well. You have the Quiet Lagoon, you have the Snorkeling Lagoon, and you also have the Active Lagoon. In addition, at Shipwreck Cove, there's a kiddie pool there. It also has a slide, and that is the entrance to the Flying Jib Slide, which is a 230-foot slide that goes from the top of the mast all the way through the mountain and down into the active pool. There's over 750,000 gallons of water in Stormalong Bay alone, upwards of 130,000 gallons in all 7 bodies of water, and 860 tons of sand is in Stormalong Bay. It's a highly specialized sand. We have a source that comes over from the Gulf Coast that we get that from. It's one of just a very few, maybe the only one in the state of Florida we actually get this sand out of, and we have to go back to them to replenish the sand as well. It is real, it is really sand. Yes, 100% real sand.
I think the most unique part is the sand, and that's what everybody loves coming here for. There are equalizer lines that connect all these bays over here. We have multiple different pumps for all the different slides, the water features. You have the waterfalls back here between Spa 1 and 2. So there's just a lot of mechanical systems involved in this. Even the windmill just spinning like that, that's all, everything we look at, there's a lot of mechanical systems that you don't see in a normal resort pool.
So if it wasn't obvious, this pool complex is huge, and it's what most guests think of when they think of the Beach and the Yacht Club hotels. It was also what most guests thought of in the early 1990s when Disney started to advertise these hotels. Because Stormalong Bay was always one of the focal points, and here's what they said in the press releases shared by newspapers at the time. Hotel guests will marvel at Stormalong Bay, a 2.5-acre water recreation area, reminiscent of Nantucket Beach, with a life-size shipwreck with water slides, snorkeling in a sandy lagoon, and a meandering area that seemingly flows into the surrounding lake. Snorkeling. Yes, snorkeling. You heard that right. Disney originally offered snorkeling with real fish, real snorkels in this water. Other newspapers go on to describe this as an area that had a lagoon-like pool stocked with bass and fish so guests could swim with fish and snorkel. Now, why am I referencing 1990s newspapers when I'm talking about snorkeling in this pool? There's kind of two reasons. First off, for some reason, the 1990 Disney Annual Shareholder Report, which is where I get a lot of my information from, is not available anywhere digitally online. In fact, this is one of the only Disney shareholder reports from like the very early days of the company that's not available online. So I had no choice but to purchase it myself from eBay. Kind of an unhinged move of me, but it was only $7.97, and I knew that 1990 was the critical year that would talk about this more, so I had to buy it. But the other reason I'm referencing old 1990s newspapers and the shareholder report that I bought online is the fact that the snorkeling actually didn't last all that long. The pool area was already incredibly complex to maintain, and the snorkeling lagoon made it even harder. First off, that water was originally salt water, and so having the two separate systems was challenging. It was also difficult to keep the pool clean. It just had a ton of maintenance. And then the fish were really struggling to thrive in that environment. Even when they switched to freshwater, it just was never super successful. And while it's hard to nail down exactly when snorkeling was closed, we can see from this letter from the 1990s that Disney was notifying guests that while advertised, the snorkeling lagoon would not be available on every trip. Eventually, the pool went under refurbishment in 1999, and the snorkeling lagoon was actually transformed into a lazy river, and that is the reason that the lazy river is about 8 feet deep, one of the deepest Disney pools on property, because it used to be for snorkeling. Even without the snorkeling, the pool was incredibly popular back then and now. But then a question kind of comes into play. What happens when you have to close one of the most popular features of a certain resort? The reason that many guests stay at this resort, and now that's not going to be there for a certain period of time. Will this impact guest occupancy? How will you tell them? How can you overall minimize the impacts to guests as much as possible while doing whatever work has to be done? Well, earlier this year, Disney did have to close the pool for about 6 months for a refurbishment. And this is where I get to put my engineering cap on because wow, never would I ever have thought so much went into something like a pool refurbishment. So let's dive into that piece. If we take a look at the sort of general engineering process a project follows, it has about 5 kind of natural steps. The first is going to be scheduling. The second is going to be scope, and those kind of go hand in hand. The third is going to be design. The fourth, public notification, and the fifth, obviously, construction. So let's start with schedule. If you had to guess how far out Disney planned this pool refurbishment of Stormalong Bay, you'd probably say, I don't know, a year, a couple years, maybe 5 years. All wrong.
We're actually looking at a 10 to 15 year program. I mean, we plan that far in advance. We have to for the guest experience, make sure that everyone is fully aware what's happening, when it's happening, the time frame that it's going to take place.
Wild, right? 10 to 15 years. But it's not just about the advanced notification for guests, although that is a big part of it. It's also about staffing and having time to design and procure materials and more. So we have the schedule. Next, they determined the scope.
So main scope usually involves replastering the pool. So we take it down to the bare concrete and replace the pebble tech material on it. This also included a significant portion of hardscape replacement. We focused on retouch-up of all the rock work, including the mountain, shipwreck as well. Obviously that kid pool on the other side, same system, same concrete replacement, touch-up of the actual ship, slide recoating, basic maintenance over there, as well as adding the ADA chair for accessibility for our guests, which is a big point.
But this pool had beyond that because it is truly so complex.
We were, again, working with Rebecca on the code compliance on certain things that we were looking at for the turnover rate of the pool, the different sand filter media that we want to use in there, the actual level of sand we want to put in the filter bays, working with our consultants to make sure we're incorporating those design considerations. We're looking at actual backwash times and making sure we're doing things the most efficient way possible.
And so basically, this pool refurbishment was so important because it improved design, it improved safety, it improved accessibility, and it improved efficiency. Now let's get into the actual design efforts where the engineers put what they want to do on paper. Some of the design they did for this refurbishment actually worked in a bit of the Imagineering side. This is where they can actually transport guests to make them feel like they really are at a beach with a shipwreck. We see engineering in all of the parks, but it does extend to the pools and the resorts too. And so one thing that the Imagineers did was add a sign detailing the backstory of the pool. But there were other things done to make the pool area feel more realistic, to really bring guests into the theme.
So this is what we call the mountain. We added about 4 feet of rock work and paint to shield that from a guest view here on the boardwalk. We'd much rather them feel like they are on the boardwalk, feel like they are at the pool, and it's just one cohesive story.
And so something like hiding this equipment is really what sets Disney apart, because they think of these small details that most places would never even consider. And this isn't just about pool equipment, it's also related to what you see when you look down.
On the back of the ship at Shipwreck, we have what's called themed stamped concrete, which not only has an integral color most of the time, but there is a very specific stamp that is used by WDI. While WDI would very, very much like to build this ship out of wood, it would need maintenance on a much more regular basis than some other materials. So the happy medium we have found, you can even see at the end here with those wood planks, that is concrete, but this is still a ship. We want you to believe you are on a wooden ship. So that is why we use the stamps.
And their goals weren't just visual design. What you might think an architect would typically take care of actually was a little bit different on this type of project.
Yes, it is very unique architecturally. It's not something that I've definitely specialized in. It's really a unique opportunity. Architecture, I do a lot with code compliance and looking at accessibility, making this more welcoming and inclusive for everyone, and a lot of just making sure that we're meeting the intent with code. We added a new accessible point of entry in the Shipwreck Cove Lagoon that wasn't there before. And then also a big portion of the scope for this was replacing 20,000 square feet of concrete deck. And a big part of that was looking at the accessible route, connecting those points of entry for our accessible guests.
I absolutely love this. So we have a friend who is in a wheelchair and uses it to navigate most of the time through life and of course through the Disney parks. And when I just think of their experience in Disney versus the experience they might have in a city like Boston, which is where I live, it is so different. A lot of us take for granted some of the lack of accessibility that is out there in the world right now. I know in Boston, a lot of the MBTA stations are not accessible for wheelchairs right now. Many of the sidewalks can't even be used by folks in a wheelchair because the ramps aren't properly built or they're so uneven that it's actually easier for them to ride in the road, which puts them at risk. There are so many things out in the real world that are so challenging for people who rely on wheelchairs. But Disney absolutely sets themselves apart in so many ways. The Disney parks are truly, I believe, some of the most accessible places in the entire world. And so the fact that Disney looked at something they already had, noticed that something was not as accessible as it could be, and made that change, I think is just absolutely amazing. Now, the final piece, almost after the design, is notifying the public, or in this case, the Disney guests. That is the critical piece right before they can really get into the construction.
Yeah, we work on a 5-year program. So we resurface our pools every 15 years, put on a cycle for that. So a feature pool of this type, we have to give a 500-day notice. It's called the European rule, where they plan so far in advance. And then our typical leisure pools, we would plan those out about 11 months in advance. We work very closely with line of business. There are notifications that are sent out well in advance. In addition, they put flyers in the rooms. We have signs all the way around the property telling everyone what's going on. The guest experience is very important. We want everybody to have the full knowledge, anything and everything that we can share as early as we possibly can. That's one of our biggest jobs. It's a big responsibility that I have, working with line of business, recreation, engineering services, and so forth. Awareness and communication is one of our primary keys around here. We want to make sure people know anything and everything that they possibly can.
So to all of the guests staying at the resort, it was no surprise that this construction was happening at all. But still, Disney wanted to make sure they minimized impacts to guests where they could. And so that brings us to how Disney actually did the construction of Stormalong Bay to refurbish it. Because there were a lot of logistics that would actually make this possible. First off, with timing, when to actually work on the pool.
Yeah, it's all based on guest occupancy. Usually our pools, we will take down the Monday after the marathon. The Monday that marathon is a huge event for Disney, so we'll usually shut the pools down the Monday afterwards, and then depending on the size and the scope of the pool, it can run anywhere from 8 to 10 weeks for a typical leisure pool. Pool like this was 6 months. Most other pools will be in about the 16 to 18 week time frame.
We focused our noisy work, as we call it, from 9 to 5. Usually guests are already at the park. We try to minimize that. We're trying not to disturb guests as much as possible.
And on top of the work hours, there were also challenges with where the actual project site is located.
This pool, incredibly tricky as far as where we're located. Obviously, we're in the middle of the boardwalk here. Boardwalk on one side and then Epcot on the other side. Our main laydown area was actually the valet lot over at Yacht Club, and most of the material came through there, through the boardwalk. Usually down hours when guests weren't traveling to the parks is what we strategized to do. And then things like the concrete and the sand deliveries, we brought in actually back of house through Epcot. Again, times that people were likely to see it, but it was based on deliveries of that.
And this is where I'm absolutely dying at how cool this was. Because I asked, how did you make sure that construction vehicles could actually access the project site if they're going through these guest-facing areas or going through the boardwalk or wherever? Did you run vehicle turning movements? Did you do load testing? The answer, of course, was yes.
First thing, before we even start construction, our friends at FAM Design, one of the first things we gather is all the load data on all materials, equipment, anything that the contractors think they'll need to bring through, and that's when we actually strategize. Let's use X amount of stuff coming through Epcot, and then the minimal stuff we decided to bring through the boardwalk. So it was one of the key items for logistics on this project.
There's a software I use in my day-to-day life, and I'm just picturing Mouselet One like falling asleep at me talking about this, but it's called vehicle tracking. And basically what it does is you can take a certain design vehicle, think a fire truck for emergencies or a passenger car or an 18-wheeler, all sorts of different types of vehicles, and run them at a certain speed and make sure they can actually make a turn. For example, sometimes cities are really hard for a large truck to make a right or a left turn at. This is the same process that the Disney and the consulting team did for this project to make sure that their construction vehicles could actually access the site. So cool, comes full circle with my job, loved that. And the boardwalk, which obviously looks like a real, boardwalk, absolutely was tested to make sure that these construction vehicles could drive on it, which they could because it's also used as an emergency fire lane, meaning it could support a fire truck. So they also went through and did all of that testing. Again, something you might not normally think of. And so they can get the equipment there, they can get the materials procured, but none of this will actually matter if they can't stick to a schedule. Because one of the biggest challenges was the fact that they had guests arriving at a certain date who expected and were paying for a pool to be open. And so they couldn't just fall 3 months behind. Not an option. They had to finish on time. And so for them to stay on track, they had
Weekly scheduling meeting where we had all of the contractors, all of our designers and so forth. We all came together on a weekly basis, worked very closely with our field team. We knew what was going to happen each and every day, each and every week, and each and every month. We were looking well in advance. Material procurement, we started procuring the materials for this one 6 months ahead of when the project actually went down to make sure that we had all the material on site and available, so we had everything in hand when we needed it.
So many partnerships that come together for the design. So within FAM itself, that's the facility asset management. We have the design team, Jared and I are both part of that, the project management team, which Jason is a part of, the field team, which Andrea and Marissa represent, and then we also have our estimating, scheduling, integrated facility planners as well. And then holistically, we also work within facility operations. And so that's our engineering service partners as well.
And this very team that was just mentioned were the ones that we were able to interview to tell us all about this incredible project and everything that went into it. And in the end, they were able to open 2 weeks early, which might not seem like that much, but I can tell you from firsthand experience, it is so easy to fall behind in a construction project. So this is actually a really amazing thing that they were able to pull off. And that is a behind the scenes look at how Disney actually pulls off their refurbishment projects. I am so grateful to the Disney team who actually allowed us to interview them, to hear their stories, and to learn about something that most people would just not even think about. So cool. So thank you to that entire team. Thanks to you for watching and learning more about this. And I will see you all next week for Mouselets Monday. Bye.